Imagine waking up one morning and finding that 19 out of every 20 living things on Earth are gone. Not sick, not struggling, gone. The oceans, silent. The forests, ash and bone. The reefs that took millions of years to build, dissolved, bleached, collapsed into nothing. The creatures that ruled the land, the sea, the sky, erased so completely that their fossils, when we finally find them, look like the remnants of an alien world. This is not a story about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Most people know that one. Hollywood made sure of that. This is the other story, the one that came 252 million years before today, the one that scientists call the Great Dying. And it makes the asteroid look like a minor inconvenience. At the end of the Permian period, life on Earth came within a razor's edge of total annihilation. Not a bad year, not a rough century. A catastrophe so absolute, so planetary, so relentless, that it took our planet 10 million years just to begin recovering. 10 million years. That is longer than the entire existence of the genus Homo. That is longer than the time separating us from our earliest recognizable human ancestors. 96% of all marine species, gone. 70% of all land vertebrate species, gone. The insects. Insects which had survived every catastrophe since they first appeared, nearly wiped out. It is the only mass extinction in Earth's history that came close to ending the insects entirely. The world that existed before the Great Dying and the world that existed after it were so different, so fundamentally, structurally, ecologically different, that paleontologists sometimes speak of them as almost separate planets. The same rock, the same oceans, but life rebuilt from almost nothing, following completely different rules. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. We still do not fully understand what caused it. Oh, we have leading hypotheses. We have volcanic records and chemical signatures and isotope ratios and ocean sediment cores. We have data. But the more data we collect, the more complex the picture becomes. Because the Great Dying was not one thing. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of planetary systems collapsing into each other like dominoes the size of continents. And somewhere buried in that story, in the rocks of Siberia and the seafloor of the Tethys Ocean and the ancient soils of what is now South Africa, is a warning written in extinction, a warning we are only now beginning to read. Stay with me, because what happened 252 million years ago is the most terrifying, the most scientifically complex, and the most strangely relevant story that Earth has ever recorded in stone. This is the Great Dying. And it begins with a world so different from ours that you would not recognize a single thing in it, except, perhaps, the sky above your head and the slowly turning stars beyond it. 260 million years ago. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a planet that is technically Earth, same gravity, same sun, same moon hanging in the same sky, but wrong in almost every way that matters. Start with the continents. There are no continents, not as we know them. What exists instead is a single, almost unimaginable landmass stretching from pole to pole, coast to coast, a supercontinent so vast that its interior, thousands of kilometers from any ocean, receives almost no rain at all. Scientists call it Pangaea, and it dominates the Permian world the way nothing has dominated Earth's geography before or since. Picture a landmass roughly the size of all modern continents combined, pressed together into one irregular shape, surrounded by a single world ocean called Panthalassa, the universal sea. It stretches across more than half the planet's surface. And along the eastern edge of Pangaea, pushing inward like a giant bite taken from the supercontinent's side, is a smaller sea, the Tethys Ocean. Warm, shallow in places, rich with life. This is the world of the late Permian, and it is, in many ways, a world at its peak. The Permian period began approximately 299 million years ago, and would last until its catastrophic end at 252 million years ago. Nearly 50 million years of geological time, long enough for ecosystems to mature, diversify, and reach extraordinary levels of complexity. The late Permian, the last 10 to 15 million years before the end, is the world we care about most, because it is the world that will be destroyed. And it is a remarkable world. In the oceans, the Permian seas are among the most biologically rich in Earth's history. The reefs of the Tethys are dominated not by corals as we know them, but by rugose and tabulate corals, ancient forms that have been building structures since the Ordovician period, hundreds of millions of years earlier. Around them swarm brachiopods, shelled animals that look superficially like clams, but are fundamentally biologically different. So numerous that in some Permian rock formations, their fossils are essentially the rock itself. Layer upon layer of shells compressed by time into limestone. Ammonites cruise the open water, elegant spiral-shelled predators that navigate by jet propulsion, their internal chambers divided by intricate folded walls that paleontologists use like fingerprints to identify individual species. Some are the size of dinner plates, some are small as coins. They are everywhere. Crinoids, animals that look like underwater flowers but are in fact relatives of starfish, cover the seafloor in metals so dense that in some Permian deposits, their fossilized columns stack like broken pillars of marble. Trilobites, ancient arthropods that first appeared over 500 million years ago, are in their final chapter, diminished from their Cambrian glory, but still present, still scuttling across the bottom sediment. And moving through all of this, the sharks. The Permian seas are full of sharks. Not the sleek white forms of modern imagination, but strange, ancient varieties. Helicoprion, a shark with a spiral jaw like a circular saw, its lower teeth arranged in a coiling whorl that paleontologists spent over a century trying to correctly reconstruct. Orthocanthus, a freshwater shark that prowled Permian swamps and rivers with a double-pointed spine behind its skull. Forms so alien that they look more like concept art than biology. This is the ocean before the end. Now come ashore. The land of the late Permian is not the jungle world of the dinosaurs. Those are still 50 million years away. The Permian land is something stranger, something that occupies an evolutionary middle ground between the ancient world of amphibians and the coming age of reptiles. The dominant vertebrates on Permian land are not dinosaurs. They are not even close relatives of dinosaurs. They are synapsids, the group of animals that includes the direct ancestors of every mammal alive today, including you. In the Permian, the synapsids rule, and the most impressive of them, the ones that sit at the top of the food chain, the ones that define the Permian megafauna, are the therapsids. Say that name. Therapsids. They will matter enormously before this story is done. The therapsids of the late Permian are varied and spectacular. Some are herbivores of extraordinary abundance, creatures like Lystrosaurus, a stocky, barrel-shaped animal roughly the size of a large pig, with a beak-like mouth for cropping tough vegetation.
Dicynodonts, two-tusked plant eaters, graze across the Pangaean landscape in herds, filling the ecological role that cattle and antelope will fill 250 million years later. And hunting them, the gorgonopsids. If you want a Permian predator to haunt your imagination, look no further. Gorgonopsids are therapsids built for killing. The largest, like Enostrancevia, reach lengths of 3.5 meters. They move on semi-erect limbs, not the sprawling posture of a lizard, but not quite the fully upright stance of a mammal either. Something in between, something transitional and powerful. But their most striking feature is their teeth. Saber teeth. Long before Smilodon, the famous saber-toothed cat of the Pleistocene Ice Age, gorgonopsids evolved the same solution to the same problem independently. Long, curved canines, sometimes exceeding 12 centimeters, designed to drive through the tough hide of large prey. Paleontologists studying gorgonopsid skulls found through isotope analysis that these animals likely had metabolic rates higher than typical reptiles, edging toward the warm-blooded efficiency that their mammalian descendants would eventually perfect. These are the apex predators of the Permian land. These are the creatures at the top. And in the late Permian, the world they inhabit, though warmer and drier than most of Earth's history, is stable. It has been stable for millions of years. Ecosystems do not collapse overnight. They build slowly, layer by layer, predator and prey and parasite and decomposer, until the whole structure becomes something like a machine, self-regulating, resilient, capable of absorbing drought and flood and temperature shift without fundamentally breaking. The late Permian ecosystem is that machine, finely tuned by millions of years of evolution, robust, interconnected, alive in every sense of the word, and it is about to be unmade. Not by an asteroid, not by a single sudden catastrophe that strikes like a hammer from the sky, by something slower, something that builds from beneath the ground, something that has been quietly gathering force for thousands of years before the first sign appears in the fossil record. Something geological, something volcanic, something so large in scale that modern scientists, when they first calculated its scope, initially refused to believe their own measurements. To understand what ends the Permian world, you first have to understand what it means when the Earth itself decides to breathe. Beneath the surface of the late Permian world, something is waking up. It has been waking up for a long time, slowly, quietly, the way the deepest geological processes always work, on timescales so vast that no living creature could perceive the change from one generation to the next. But the change is coming, and when it arrives at the surface, it will not arrive gently. To understand what is about to happen, you need to understand a concept that geologists call a large igneous province. Most volcanic eruptions we are familiar with, Mount Vesuvius, Mount St. Helens, even Krakatoa, are dramatic, devastating on a local scale, and geologically speaking, small. They erupt from relatively contained magma chambers, release their energy over days or weeks or months, and then quiet down. The damage they cause, as catastrophic as it feels to human observers, is regional, temporary. The planet absorbs it and moves on. A large igneous province is something categorically different. A large igneous province forms when a massive plume of superheated rock rises from deep within the Earth's mantle, from hundreds of kilometers below the surface, and punches through the overlying crust in a way that is not a single eruption,
but a prolonged, sustained, continental-scale outpouring of lava that continues not for days or weeks, but for thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years.
The lava does not erupt from a single volcano. It pours from fissures, cracks in the crust kilometers long that open like wounds across the landscape. The lava floods outward in sheets, layer upon layer, building up basaltic plateaus that can reach thicknesses of several kilometers across areas the size of modern countries. And sitting directly beneath what is now Siberia, in the late Permian world, one of the largest mantle plumes in Earth's history is beginning its ascent. What it will create, what it is already beginning to create, is the Siberian Traps. The word traps comes from the Swedish word for stairs, trappa, because the layered basalt flows, eroded by millions of years of weathering, create stepped landscapes that look like giant stone staircases descending across the terrain. But the name gives no impression of the actual scale of what happened here. The Siberian Traps, at their maximum extent, covered an area of approximately 7 million square kilometers. To put that in terms that mean something, that is roughly the size of the entire continent of Australia, buried under layer after layer of volcanic basalt, in places reaching depths of 3 to 4 kilometers. Some estimates suggest the total volume of material erupted during the main pulse of activity reached 2 to 3 million cubic kilometers. 2 to 3 million cubic kilometers of molten rock poured onto the surface of the Earth. Over a period of approximately 1 million years, centered almost precisely on the Permian-Triassic boundary, the moment in geological time when everything dies. This is not a coincidence. But here is the thing, and this is crucial. The lava itself, as devastating as it is to local ecosystems, is not the primary killer. Lava flows, even on this scale, move slowly enough that animals can flee. The direct destruction from volcanic rock is significant, but it is not what kills 96% of all marine life. What kills is what the volcanoes exhale. When magma rises through the Earth's crust in Siberia, it does not rise through clean, empty rock. It rises through something far more dangerous. Thick sequences of ancient sedimentary rocks, some of the largest coal deposits and evaporite beds in the world. Evaporites are rocks formed by the evaporation of ancient seas. They contain enormous quantities of sulfates and chlorides and, critically, carbon-rich organic material that has been buried and compressed for hundreds of millions of years. When the superheated magma intrudes into these sediments, not just erupting at the surface, but baking the rock from within through what geologists call sill intrusions, it cooks that organic material. It bakes the coal. It superheats the evaporites. And in doing so, it releases gases. Enormous, sustained, planetary-scale releases of gas. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride. The numbers that researchers have attempted to calculate for total gas release during the Siberian Traps eruption are, frankly, almost too large to process. Studies published in journals including Science and Nature Geoscience have proposed that the eruption may have released between 10,000 and 48,000 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere over the course of its most active phase. To put that in context, all of human industrial activity since the beginning of the Coal Age has released roughly 500 gigatons of carbon. The Siberian Traps, at its most intense, may have been releasing the equivalent of our entire industrial output every few years, and doing so continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. The carbon dioxide drives rapid, intense global warming. The sulfur dioxide forms sulfuric acid aerosols that first cause sudden cooling, volcanic winters that plunge temperatures dramatically, before the longer-term warming from carbon dioxide dominates. The hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride attack the ozone layer, stripping away the planet's protection from ultraviolet radiation. And the methane, released both directly from volcanic cooking of organic sediments and indirectly as warming ocean waters destabilize frozen methane deposits on the seafloor, adds another powerful pulse of greenhouse warming on top of everything else. This is what geologists mean when they talk about the kill mechanism of the Great Dying. Not one weapon, but an arsenal. Not one blow, but a sustained, compounding, multi-front assault on every system that keeps a planet habitable. The atmosphere warms, then warms again, then warms further. But here is where the story becomes even more complex, because the Siberian Traps, catastrophic as they are, may not have acted alone. In the rocks of the Permian-Triassic boundary, a layer of sediment so distinctive that geologists can identify it on every continent and in ocean cores from every major basin, there are chemical signatures that have sparked decades of scientific debate. Some researchers looking at platinum group element concentrations in boundary layer rocks have raised the possibility of an extraterrestrial impact component, an asteroid or comet strike that may have coincided with, or possibly triggered, the main volcanic pulse. This hypothesis remains controversial. Most paleontologists and geologists working on the Great Dying today consider the Siberian Traps sufficient on their own to explain the extinction. But the debate has not been fully closed, and some studies continue to find anomalies in the boundary chemistry that are difficult to explain through volcanism alone. What is not debated is the result. Look at a graph of species diversity through geological time, the kind of graph that researchers build from counting fossil types through layer after layer of rock, and the Permian-Triassic boundary looks like a cliff edge, a vertical drop. Thousands of species represented in Permian rocks simply vanish from the record, not declining gradually, not thinning out over millions of years, gone, abruptly. In geological terms, almost instantaneously. But exactly how fast is almost instantaneous on a geological timescale? This is one of the most fiercely contested questions in the entire field of extinction research, and the answer has changed dramatically as dating technology has improved. Early studies working with the relatively crude radiometric tools of the mid-20th century suggested the extinction played out over perhaps 10 million years. Later work compressed that estimate to 1 or 2 million years. But in 2011, a team led by researcher Shuzhong Shen from the Nanjing Institute of Geology and Paleontology published a landmark study in the journal Science that used high-precision uranium-lead dating on rocks from a critical boundary section in southern China. Their conclusion was stunning. The main pulse of extinction, the moment when the vast majority of species disappeared, took place in approximately 60,000 years, possibly less. 60,000 years. In geological time, that is not even a heartbeat. That is the blink of an eye. That is, terrifyingly, a timescale that begins to feel almost comprehensible from a human perspective. 60,000 years ago, our own species was already walking the earth, painting cave walls, crossing land bridges between continents. What killed the Permian world did not grind it down slowly over millions of years. It hit fast, by geological standards, fast enough that ecosystems had almost no time to adapt, fast enough that evolutionary responses, the slow generational process by which populations adjust to changing conditions, were simply outpaced by the speed of environmental change. The world warmed faster than life could follow. But knowing the speed of the killer and knowing the weapon is still not the same as understanding the actual experience of dying. The lived reality, if we can use that phrase, of what it meant to be a creature in the Permian Ocean or on the Permian land as the world changed around you. For that, we need to go back to the boundary itself. We need to read what the rocks remember. There was a place in southern China, in Zhejiang province, called Meishan. It does not look like much. A quarry, mostly. Limestone cliffs carved by decades of mining, exposed rock faces streaked with gray and brown, and the occasional rust of iron oxidation. Tourists do not visit Meishan. It does not appear in travel guides. There are no hotels nearby advertising scenic views. But among geologists and paleontologists, Meishan is one of the most important places on Earth. Because in those unremarkable limestone cliffs, perfectly preserved in continuous unbroken sequence, is the moment the fossils of foraminifera, microscopic shelled organisms that float in ocean water and rain down onto the seafloor in enormous quantities when they die, are so abundant that they essentially constitute the rock itself. Brachiopods, coral fragments, the calcified remains of a productive, complex, layered marine ecosystem. Busy, diverse, rich. Then comes the boundary layer itself. It is thin, disturbingly thin. A band of dark, carbon-rich clay, sometimes no more than a few centimeters thick, sometimes absent entirely where erosion has removed it. But where it is preserved, at Meishan, at dozens of other boundary sections around the world, from the Austrian Alps to the Karoo Basin of South Africa to the high Arctic of Svalbard, it tells the same story. The fossils stop. Not gradually, not slowly fading out over hundreds of meters of rock as species one by one disappear. They stop. The diverse fossil-rich Permian limestone gives way to the boundary clay, and the boundary clay is almost empty. And above it, the early Triassic rock is equally barren. For meters and meters of rock representing hundreds of thousands to millions of years of time, almost nothing lives. Almost nothing leaves a fossil record. Paleontologists call this interval the survival interval, or sometimes with a bleakness that feels entirely appropriate, the dead zone. But the emptiness of the rocks is only the beginning of what they tell us. Because modern geochemical analysis can extract information from ancient rock that goes far beyond simply counting fossils. And what that analysis reveals about conditions at the Permian-Triassic boundary is, even now, genuinely shocking. Start with the carbon isotope record. Carbon exists in several isotopic forms, variants of the same element with slightly different atomic masses. Carbon-12 is the most common. Carbon-13 is slightly heavier and slightly less abundant. Living organisms preferentially incorporate carbon-12 into their tissues during photosynthesis and other biological processes, meaning that organic material, anything that was once alive, is relatively depleted in carbon-13 compared to inorganic carbon dissolved in seawater. When you measure the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 through a sequence of rocks, you get what geochemists call the carbon isotope excursion, a record of how the balance between organic and inorganic carbon in the ocean atmosphere system shifted over time. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, the carbon isotope record does something dramatic. It plunges. A sudden massive negative excursion, a rapid shift toward carbon-13 depletion that is visible in boundary sections on every continent. What this shift means is that an enormous pulse of carbon-12 entered the ocean atmosphere system at the boundary.
Carbon-12 rich carbon, organic carbon, the kind of carbon that comes from burning or decomposing biological material or from volcanic release of carbon that was originally sequestered in organic sediments. The Siberian Traps, cooking coal and organic-rich sediments from below, injecting enormous quantities of light carbon into the atmosphere. The signal is there in the rock, written in isotope ratios, preserved for 252 million years. But the carbon record is only one signal among many. The sulfur isotope record shows evidence of ocean anoxia, conditions where the deep ocean lost its dissolved oxygen, turning from a life-supporting environment into a toxic, oxygen-depleted dead zone where only anaerobic bacteria could survive. When the deep ocean loses oxygen, sulfate-reducing bacteria thrive, producing hydrogen sulfide, a gas that is acutely toxic to animal life at relatively low concentrations.
Researchers studying the sulfur chemistry of Permian-Triassic boundary sections have found evidence that hydrogen sulfide may have bubbled up from anoxic deep waters into shallow coastal environments and even into the atmosphere itself. Imagine standing on a late Permian beach as this happens. The water around you, which has always been clear and productive, begins to change color, darkening, greening, smelling of rot. The hydrogen sulfide rising from below. The marine creatures in the shallows beginning to die in waves, their bodies accumulating on the shore. And above you, the sky carrying that same deadly chemistry outward, inland, over the land ecosystems that are already struggling under the weight of volcanic warming and acid rain. The boron isotope record tells us about ocean acidification, the drop in seawater pH as dissolved carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid. The ocean of the latest Permian became dramatically more acidic, and for creatures that build their shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, the brachiopods, the corals, the foraminifera, the mollusks, acidic water is a direct chemical attack on the very structures that keep them alive. Calcium carbonate dissolves in acid. The animals that had spent millions of years perfecting the biochemistry of shell building suddenly found themselves in an ocean where shell building was becoming chemically impossible, where the material of their bodies was dissolving faster than it could be replaced. The oxygen isotope record, extracted from the tiny shells of foraminifera preserved in boundary sediments, gives us temperature. And what it shows is that sea surface temperatures in the tropics spiked dramatically at and just after the boundary. Studies published in the journal Science have estimated tropical ocean temperatures reaching somewhere between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius during the most severe phase of the extinction. 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. Modern tropical oceans average around 28 to 30 degrees. Modern coral reefs begin bleaching and dying when temperatures exceed 31 degrees for sustained periods. The latest Permian tropics, by these estimates, were not just warm, they were physiologically lethal for most marine animals. Too hot for the biochemical processes that keep cells alive to function correctly. At those temperatures, the equatorial ocean becomes a dead zone not because of chemistry alone, but because of heat itself. Life retreats toward the poles, where temperatures remain somewhat lower, but the poles, too, are warming. There is no refuge, there is nowhere to go. And on land, the story told by the rocks is equally grim. The Karoo Basin of South Africa is one of the greatest terrestrial windows into the Permian-Triassic transition. Thousands of meters of ancient river and floodplain sediments, preserving bones, teeth, and traces of the complex late Permian land ecosystem and what came immediately after. South African paleontologist Robert Broom, working in the early 20th century,
first recognized the extraordinary fossil wealth of the Karoo. Later researchers, including teams from the South African Museum, the University of the Witwatersrand, and international collaborators from institutions across Europe and North America, have spent decades systematically excavating and analyzing those fossils, building a picture of ecological change across the boundary that is both detailed and deeply unsettling. Below the boundary in the Karoo, the fossil record is diverse. Gorgonopsids, multiple species of dicynodonts, a variety of smaller insectivorous and omnivorous therapsids. Therocephalians, another group of mammal-like therapsids with some remarkably mammalian skeletal features. And the first true cynodonts, the group that will eventually, tens of millions of years down the road, give rise to the mammals, a complex, layered, multi-species community. Above the boundary, a handful of survivors, mostly Lystrosaurus, just Lystrosaurus, in overwhelming, almost monocultural abundance. The gorgonopsids are gone. Most of the other dicynodonts are gone. The ecosystem has been stripped down to almost nothing, leaving behind primarily the species that happen to be small enough, generalist enough, tough enough to endure conditions that killed almost everything else. But the Karoo record reveals something beyond simple before and after. Studies of paleosol chemistry, the chemistry of ancient soils preserved in the Karoo, show evidence of repeated severe drought cycles in the latest Permian, alternating with episodes of intense flooding. The landscape was not simply warming, it was destabilizing. The predictable seasonal patterns that ecosystems depend on for reproduction, migration, and resource availability were breaking down, becoming erratic, unpredictable. For animals whose breeding cycles, food availability, and water access depend on seasonal regularity, which is essentially all complex vertebrates, this kind of ecological unpredictability is as lethal as any single environmental extreme. It is not just that the world got too hot. It is that the world stopped being reliable. And there is one more signal in the rocks that ties all of this together. One more piece of the boundary chemistry that points toward a mechanism so extreme, so far outside anything life had experienced for hundreds of millions of years, that it still generates fierce debate when it appears in a new paper or conference presentation. In boundary sections from multiple locations around the world, researchers have found evidence of something extraordinary in the spore and pollen record, the microscopic plant fossils that record the vegetation of an ancient world. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, the abundance of plant spores does not simply decline, it collapses. And replacing the normal diversity of plant pollen and spores is something strange. Something that researchers first noticed in the 1980s and have been arguing about ever since. Malformed spores. Twisted, distorted, abnormal pollen grains. Reproductive structures that show clear evidence of developmental disruption. Mutations. The kind of cellular damage associated with exposure to elevated ultraviolet radiation. The kind that floods through an atmosphere when the ozone layer has been stripped away by volcanic gases. The plants of the late Permian were being irradiated. Their reproductive systems were failing. Their DNA, bombarded by ultraviolet light that a healthy ozone layer would normally absorb, was being damaged at the cellular level, producing malformed offspring, failing to reproduce normally. And when the plants fail, when the foundation of every terrestrial food web begins to crack, everything built on top of it begins to fall. The herbivores that eat the plants, the predators that eat the herbivores, the scavengers, the decomposers. Every link in the chain stressed simultaneously from the bottom up and the top down and everywhere in between. This is what the rocks remember. Not a single blow, not a clean surgical extinction event with one cause and one mechanism and one moment of impact. A cascade. A compounding, accelerating, multi-system collapse where each failure made the next one worse, and the next one worse still, until the machine of life, that finely tuned, resilient, self-regulating machine that had been running for hundreds of millions of years, simply could not keep up. The rocks remember all of it. And now we need to go back to that world, back into the dying itself, back to what it actually looked like and felt like as the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life unfolded, one terrible threshold at a time. Let us go to the sea. 252 million years ago, the Tethys Ocean. A shallow, warm-water reef system somewhere along the western margin of Pangaea, a place that will eventually, after hundreds of millions of years of continental drift and mountain building, become the limestone peaks of the Italian Dolomites. Right now, it is underwater. Warm, clear, sunlit to a depth of perhaps 30 meters, productive beyond anything most modern ocean ecosystems can match. This is where the dying is most complete. This is where 96% means something you can almost see. Imagine descending into that late Permian reef. The water is warm, warmer than it should be already even before the worst of it arrives. The reef structure itself is a cathedral of biological architecture built over millions of years. Rugose corals branching upward in fans and columns, tabulate corals forming honeycomb platforms that other organisms colonize in layers. Between them, forests of crinoids sway in the current, their feathery arms extended to catch particles of organic matter drifting past. Brachiopods cluster on every hard surface. Bryozoans, colonial filter feeders that build lacy net-like structures of calcium carbonate, encrust the reef framework. Ammonites cruise through the open water above, their shells catching the refracted light from the surface. A school of ray-finned fish, ancestors of the lineage that will eventually dominate all the world's oceans, turns and flashes in unison. It is, by any measure, one of the most biologically diverse environments the world has ever produced. Now watch what happens to it. The first sign is the chemistry. Long before temperatures reach lethal levels, long before the oxygen disappears, the ocean's chemistry begins to shift. Carbon dioxide dissolving into surface water, carbonic acid forming, the pH dropping, slowly at first, then faster, as the Siberian Traps intensify their output and the atmosphere loads with carbon dioxide faster than the ocean can buffer it. The organisms that feel this first are the ones most dependent on calcium carbonate. The reef builders, the shell makers. For a coral polyp, that tiny, soft-bodied animal that secretes a hard calcium carbonate skeleton and spends its entire life adding to the reef structure around it, the acidifying ocean is a slow chemical suffocation. The process of calcification, of pulling calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and organizing them into hard skeletal material, requires those ions to be available in the right concentrations. As pH drops, carbonate ion concentration falls. The chemistry that drives calcification begins to work against the animal instead of for it. The coral does not die suddenly. It thins. Its skeleton becomes more porous, more fragile. Growth slows. The symbiotic algae living in its tissues, the zooxanthellae that provide up to 90% of the coral's energy through photosynthesis, begin to die off as water temperatures rise, leaving the coral bleached and starving, even as its skeleton is chemically dissolving beneath it. This is the beginning of reef collapse. And reef collapse in the late Permian is not like modern coral bleaching events, severe as those are. It is total, complete, absolute. The rugose corals and tabulate corals that built the Permian reefs do not make it across the boundary. Not a single species. They go extinct at the end of the Permian and never return. The reef-building role they occupied, an ecological niche that had existed for hundreds of millions of years, is left vacant for approximately 10 million years after the extinction. 10 million years without reefs. The ocean floor, where complex reef communities once thrived, becomes a monotonous, largely barren expanse of soft sediment and microbial mat. The only things that genuinely flourish in the aftermath are the organisms that require almost nothing. The stromatolites, the microbial films, the simple organisms that dominated Earth's oceans before complex life emerged and that have been waiting, patient as stone, for the conditions that favor them to return. But the reef collapse, devastating as it is only the most visible symptom of something happening throughout the water column. Deeper in the ocean, the circulation is failing. Modern oceans are kept oxygenated by a process called thermohaline circulation, a global system of deep water formation driven by temperature and salinity differences between water masses. Cold, dense, oxygen-rich water sinks at the poles, flowing along the ocean floor toward the tropics, while warmer, lighter water flows along the surface in the opposite direction. This circulation acts like a giant pump, continuously delivering fresh oxygen to the deep ocean and allowing complex animal life to exist at all depths. In the late Permian, as global temperatures rise under the weight of volcanic carbon dioxide, the temperature difference between tropical and polar waters begins to shrink. The poles warm. The temperature gradient that drives deep water formation weakens. Circulation slows. And as circulation slows, the deep ocean, no longer receiving a steady supply of oxygenated surface water, begins to suffocate. This process is called ocean stagnation, and it has happened before in Earth's history, during other warm periods. But in the latest Permian, the scale and speed of the warming drives it to an extreme that the ocean has rarely, if ever, experienced. As oxygen levels in deep water fall, the organisms that need oxygen, which is to say virtually all complex animal life, either move into shallower, still oxygenated water or die. But shallow water is warming simultaneously, approaching temperatures that exceed the thermal tolerance of most marine species. There is a squeeze, a shrinking band of habitable conditions caught between lethally hot surface water above and anoxic, increasingly toxic deep water below. And then the hydrogen sulfide arrives. In the oxygen-depleted deep ocean, anaerobic bacteria, the kind that metabolize sulfate compounds instead of oxygen, begin to dominate. Their metabolic waste product is hydrogen sulfide. As these bacteria proliferate across the anoxic deep ocean floor, they produce hydrogen sulfide in quantities that, according to studies published in Geology and other journals, may have created genuine sulfidic ocean conditions, what researchers call a eugenic ocean, across vast areas of the Permian seafloor. Hydrogen sulfide is acutely toxic to aerobic life. It interferes directly with the cellular machinery that uses oxygen for energy production. At sufficient concentrations, it kills within minutes. A eugenic deep ocean would have been, for any complex animal unfortunate enough to sink into it, instantly lethal. But hydrogen sulfide does not stay in the deep ocean. As it builds up in anoxic water masses, it can rise, through upwelling events, through the breakdown of stratification between water layers, into the photic zone, the sunlit surface layer where life is most concentrated. and potentially, as some researchers have proposed in papers, including a highly cited 2005 study in the journal Geology by Lee Kump and colleagues, it may have escaped the ocean surface entirely, venting into the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to further damage the ozone layer and poison coastal and inland environments. Imagine the shoreline of the Tethys Ocean during the peak of the extinction. The water along the coast is not blue. It is dark, greenish, brownish, suffused with the pigments of the anaerobic bacteria that now dominate the shallow water chemistry. The smell that reaches the shore is sulfurous, ancient. The smell of a world running on the wrong chemistry. The beaches are covered with the dead. Not just fish and marine invertebrates washing ashore, though there are plenty of those. The tide itself carries a cargo of shells, brachiopods, ammonites, the remains of creatures that have been building those shells for their entire evolutionary history, piled in drifts along the waterline like the debris after a catastrophic storm. But no storm made this. And in the water, the ammonites are struggling. Ammonites, those elegant coiled navigators of the Permian seas, are a group with a deep evolutionary history. They have survived previous extinction events, bounced back, diversified, spread across every ocean basin. They are resilient in ways that most marine groups are not. But the end Permian extinction is a test that even ammonite resilience cannot fully pass. The ammonite fossil record through the Permian-Triassic boundary shows a catastrophic collapse in diversity. From the many species that swarm the late Permian oceans, the group is reduced at the boundary to perhaps one or two surviving lineages, clinging to existence in whatever marginal refugia remain where temperature, oxygen, and chemistry remain within survivable limits. From those one or two survivors, they will eventually recover and diversify again across the Triassic and Jurassic. But that recovery takes millions of years. The trilobites are not so fortunate. They have been declining since the end of the Devonian period, nearly 100 million years before the Great Dying. The end Permian extinction is their final chapter. The last trilobite species, already reduced to a handful of lingering forms, disappear from the fossil record at the Permian-Triassic boundary and are never seen again. A lineage that first appeared over 500 million years ago, that had diversified into thousands of species, that had explored nearly every marine ecological niche available, gone. Completely. Irrevocably. 500 million years of evolutionary history ended at a geological line in a Chinese limestone quarry. And yet, and this is something that the fossil record makes clear and that researchers have spent considerable effort trying to explain, the dying in the ocean was not instantaneous, even on a biological timescale. It was fast by geological standards, agonizingly fast, but it was not a single moment. Studies of the Meishan section and other high-resolution boundary records suggest that the marine extinction may have occurred in at least two distinct pulses, a preliminary wave of extinction in the latest Permian, followed by a second, more severe pulse precisely at the boundary itself. Some researchers propose a third pulse in the earliest Triassic, as conditions that were already catastrophic deteriorated still further. This pulsed pattern matters because it tells us something about the killing mechanism. A single instantaneous catastrophe, an asteroid impact for instance, tends to produce a single sharp extinction horizon. Multiple pulses suggest a sustained, varying stressor, something that came in waves, that relaxed briefly before intensifying again, that gave ecosystems just enough respite to partially stabilize before hitting them again with renewed force. The Siberian Traps did not erupt at a perfectly constant rate. Volcanism pulsed. Carbon dioxide injection into the atmosphere pulsed. Temperature rose in stages, not smoothly. Each new volcanic pulse may have pushed conditions past another threshold, another tipping point beyond which some additional portion of surviving marine diversity could not persist. The ocean was being killed in chapters, and each chapter left fewer survivors to face the next one. By the time the worst was over, by the time the Siberian Traps began their long, slow decline in activity and the atmosphere began its even slower recovery, the ocean that remained was almost unrecognizable. Its chemistry was wrong. Its temperature was wrong. Its circulation was wrong.
The complex, layered ecosystem that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build had been stripped to its foundations. What remained in the earliest Triassic Ocean was not a healthy ecosystem in recovery. It was a disaster zone in shock. And on land, on the surface of Pangaea, under skies that were hazy with volcanic aerosols and thick with carbon dioxide that had not existed in those concentrations for hundreds of millions of years, a different but equally devastating version of the same catastrophe was playing out. The land creatures were dying too, and among them were some of the most extraordinary animals that had ever walked the earth. Come ashore. Leave the poisoned, darkening waters of the Tethys behind and walk inland across the surface of Pangaea. 252 million years ago, the late Permian supercontinent stretching before you in every direction, an unbroken expanse of land so vast that the horizon gives no hint of any ocean beyond it. The first thing you notice is the sky. It is wrong. Not dramatically, not cinematically wrong, not the lurid orange skies of disaster movies, wrong in a quieter, more unsettling way. A persistent haze, a thickness to the air that scatters the light differently, softening the edges of the sun, giving midday an almost twilight quality in the regions downwind of the volcanic activity to the north. The air smells faintly of sulfur, not overwhelmingly, not yet, but enough to notice, enough to make the back of your throat feel raw after breathing it for any length of time. The temperature is high, higher than it has been in millions of years, and rising. But the landscape itself, before you look too closely, might still seem alive. The late Permian land is not barren, not yet. There are still forests here, though they are not the lush, wet, fern-choked jungles of the Carboniferous period that came before. The climate of Pangaea's interior has always been dry. The sheer size of the supercontinent means that moisture from the oceans rarely penetrates far inland. The vegetation is adapted to seasonal drought, tough, resilient, dominated by seed plants. The glossopterids in the southern hemisphere, distinctive seed ferns with tongue-shaped leaves that grew in vast forests across what is now Antarctica, South America, India, Africa, and Australia. Glossopteris. Remember that name. The glossopterid forests of the southern supercontinent are one of the most important plant communities in Earth's history. Their distribution, found fossilized on every continent that was once part of Gondwana, the southern half of Pangaea, was one of the key pieces of evidence that Alfred Wegener used in the early 20th century to argue for continental drift. When he saw the same fossil plant in rocks from Antarctica, India, and South Africa, he understood that those land masses must once have been connected. But in the late Permian, the glossopterids are still alive, still growing, still forming the foundation of the southern Pangaean food web, the primary food source for the enormous herds of dicynodonts that graze across the floodplains and river margins of the southern supercontinent. And it is in those southern landscapes,
preserved in exquisite detail in the Karoo Basin of what is now South Africa and in correlative formations across Antarctica, India, and Australia, that we can read the story of what happens to land life at the Permian-Triassic boundary. The Karoo Basin is, for paleontologists studying the end Permian land extinction, what Meishan is for marine researchers: a window, a record, an archive written in ancient sediment. The rocks of the Karoo preserve millions of years of floodplain and river channel deposits, mudstones and sandstones and siltstones laid down by river systems that once drained southward across the Gondwana portion of Pangaea. Within those sediments, bones. Thousands of bones. The preserved remains of the therapsid-dominated ecosystem of the late Permian and the sparse, devastated world of the early Triassic. South African paleontologist Robert Broom began pulling therapsid fossils from the Karoo in the early 1900s, recognizing that these mammal-like reptiles represented something extraordinary in evolutionary terms: the direct ancestors of every mammal alive today, preserved in rock with an intimacy and abundance found nowhere else on Earth. Later researchers, Roger Smith, Jennifer Botha, Kenneth Angelchik, and many others working across institutions from Cape Town to Chicago, have spent decades refining our understanding of what those Karoo fossils record across the extinction boundary. What they record is a disaster. In the latest Permian Karoo sediments, the Dicynodon assemblage zone, named for the most abundant large animal it preserves, the fossil record shows a community of perhaps a dozen or more large vertebrate species, gorgonopsids in several size classes occupying different predatory roles, multiple Dicynodont species of varying body sizes, from pig-sized forms to animals approaching 2 meters in length, therocephalians, cynodonts, small insectivorous forms, a complex vertically structured community with multiple trophic levels. Now move up through the rock into the earliest Triassic, the Lystrosaurus assemblage zone. The gorgonopsids are gone. Completely. Every species, the entire group, which had been evolving and diversifying for tens of millions of years, which had produced the dominant large predators of the Permian world, goes extinct at the boundary without leaving a single surviving lineage. Most of the Dicynodont species are gone. The therocephalians are decimated. The diversity of the entire community collapses to a tiny fraction of its former richness. And in their place, Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus. A small to medium-sized Dicynodont, most individuals between 1 and 1.5 meters long, roughly the bulk of a large dog or small sheep. A stocky, rather ungainly animal with a short, deep skull, a beak-like front to its jaws, and 2 small tusks. Not impressive by any previous Permian standard, not the apex of anything. In the late Permian ecosystem, Lystrosaurus is one species among many, common enough, successful enough, but unremarkable in the broader context of a rich and diverse community. In the early Triassic, Lystrosaurus is essentially everything. Studies of early Triassic Karoo fossils suggest that Lystrosaurus may have constituted somewhere between 80 and 95% of individual vertebrate animals in some fossil assemblages. Not 80 to 95% of species, 80 to 95% of individual animals. The world's most catastrophic ecosystem collapse produced on land a monoculture, a world of almost nothing but Lystrosaurus, a biological monotony so extreme that it has no real parallel in any other interval of Earth's vertebrate history. Lystrosaurus, as a result, became one of the most studied animals in all of paleontology, not because it is spectacular, but because it survived, and understanding how and why it survived tells us something profound about the nature of extinction itself. Several factors have been proposed. Lystrosaurus was small enough to burrow, and there is evidence from bone histology and behavioral inference that some populations may have used burrows to escape temperature extremes, a strategy similar to modern burrowing animals that shelter from desert heat. It was a generalist feeder. Its beak and jaw structure suggest it could process a wide variety of tough plant material, making it less vulnerable to the collapse of any particular plant community.
And it may have had a relatively high tolerance for atmospheric carbon dioxide and low oxygen conditions. Research on bone growth rings suggests it grew quickly and had an active lifestyle, consistent with at least partial warm-bloodedness that might have helped it cope with temperature fluctuations. But perhaps most importantly, Lystrosaurus was simply common. Enormously common before the extinction. The statistical reality of mass extinction is that widespread, abundant species have more survivors simply because they start with more individuals. Rarity, in an extinction event, is a death sentence. Abundance is a form of insurance. Lystrosaurus had abundance, and so Lystrosaurus survived. But the survival of Lystrosaurus, impressive as it is in the context of the catastrophe around it, does not mean the land ecosystem was functioning. Far from it. The early Triassic terrestrial world preserved in the Karoo and in correlative formations around the world, in the Fremont Formation of Antarctica, in the Panchette Formation of India, in the Juchai-Yon Formation of China, is a profoundly disturbed system. The sedimentology alone tells the story. In the latest Permian Karoo, the river systems recorded in the sediment are meandering, slow, sinuous channels that indicate stable banks held in place by dense vegetation. Bank stability requires plant roots. Plant roots require plants. The meandering river pattern of the late Permian Karoo reflects a functioning, vegetated landscape. Immediately above the extinction boundary, the river pattern changes, abruptly and completely. The meandering channels give way to braided river systems, wide, shallow, constantly shifting networks of channels that spread across open floodplains with no fixed course. Braided rivers form where banks are unstable, where there is insufficient vegetation to hold the sediment in place, where the landscape has been stripped of its plant cover to the point where erosion runs unchecked. The forests of the late Permian, the glossopterid forests that had defined the Gondwana landscape for millions of years, were gone at the boundary. Not thinned, not reduced, gone. The glossopterids go extinct at the end of the Permian as completely as the gorgonopsids, leaving behind a landscape as barren and unstable as a freshly disturbed construction site, but continental in scale. And here the malformed spore record becomes critical again. The ultraviolet radiation flooding through the damaged ozone layer, the same radiation that the malformed spores record in their twisted, abnormal forms, attack the plants not just by damaging individual organisms, but by disrupting reproduction at the population level. Even plants that could tolerate the heat and the acid rain and the altered atmospheric chemistry could not reproduce normally if their spores and pollen were being mutated by elevated ultraviolet exposure. The reproductive failure of the plant communities may have been as important as their direct mortality in driving the collapse of terrestrial ecosystems. No plants, no stable soils, braided rivers eroding unprotected landscapes, dust storms sweeping across bare floodplains, flash floods carving new channels across terrain with no root systems to slow the runoff. Into this destabilized, largely denuded world, the surviving animals were released to find food, water, and shelter in a landscape that offered almost none of what they needed. The thermal stress on land survivors was also extreme. Studies of growth rings in Lystrosaurus bones,
Those same annual growth interruptions that tree rings record in wood show evidence of metabolic stress and interrupted growth patterns consistent with severe seasonal temperature extremes. The world that Lystrosaurus inhabited in the early Triassic was not merely warm. It was erratically, dangerously warm, with evidence from sedimentary records suggesting seasonal temperature swings that may have exceeded anything in the previous or subsequent history of land vertebrates. And the predators, the ecological role that the gorgonopsids had filled for tens of millions of years, were gone. For a brief, strange period in the earliest Triassic, the land world of Pangaea was a world almost without large predators. The gorgonopsids had been too specialized, too large, too dependent on a diverse prey base to survive the collapse. Their extinction left a vacuum at the top of the terrestrial food web that would not be properly filled for millions of years, until a new group of archosaurs, the ancestors of the crocodilians and eventually the dinosaurs, evolved into the predatory roles that the therapsids had abandoned. But that is still millions of years away. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, the land is a world of survivors and scavengers, of opportunists scratching existence from a landscape that barely supports life, of Lystrosaurus herds moving across barren floodplains, cropping whatever sparse vegetation manages to grow between the braided river channels, of small cynodonts, the survivors from the mammal line, hunting insects and worms in the debris of a collapsed world. It is not the dramatic, violent end that Hollywood imagines for a mass extinction. It is quieter than that, more desolate. The violence has already happened, in the slow chemistry of the ocean, in the volcanic exhalations of the Siberian Traps, in the stripping of the ozone layer and the acidification of the rain and the collapse of the forests. What remains in the aftermath is simply emptiness, a world that used to be full, now hollow, a machine that used to run, now still. And yet, life remained, clinging, reduced, diminished beyond anything it had experienced since the Cambrian explosion first populated the planet with complex animals. But not gone, not quite gone. And in that bare, desperate survival, in the tenacity of Lystrosaurus on its barren floodplains, in the persistence of a few ammonite lineages in marginal ocean refugia, in the microscopic cyanobacteria and stromatolites rebuilding the chemistry of the sea one molecular reaction at a time, the seeds of something new were already present. Something that would take millions of years to grow. Something that would eventually fill the empty world with creatures so different from anything that came before that the Permian survivors, could they somehow have seen it, would not have recognized the planet they had saved simply by surviving. The age of the dinosaurs was coming, but first, there was the aftermath to endure. And the aftermath of the Great Dying was, in its own way, almost as terrible as the dying itself. Survival is not the same as recovery. This is perhaps the most important lesson that the aftermath of the Great Dying teaches us, and it is a lesson written with painful clarity in the rocks of the early Triassic, a geological interval that lasted approximately 5 million years and that stands in the fossil record as one of the strangest and most desolate chapters in the entire history of complex life on Earth. We have a tendency, when we think about mass extinctions, to imagine them as events with clean endings. The catastrophe happens, the dust settles, life begins to recover. Slowly at first, then faster, filling the empty ecological space with new forms, new species, new complexity. The story of resilience, the triumph of life over adversity. The early Triassic does not tell that story, not for a very long time. What the early Triassic tells, instead, is the story of a world that survived the killing, but could not escape its consequences. A world where the environmental conditions that drove the extinction did not simply switch off when the last Permian species disappeared, where the Siberian Traps continued to erupt, where ocean temperatures remained lethally high, where atmospheric carbon dioxide stayed elevated, where the chemistry of the sea remained hostile to the shell-building, reef-constructing, calcium carbonate-dependent organisms that might otherwise have begun rebuilding marine ecosystems. The early Triassic is the dead zone, and understanding it requires sitting with an uncomfortable truth, that the Earth, after the Great Dying, was sick for a very long time. Consider the oceans first. In a normal recovery from a mass extinction, and paleontologists can compare several, having the geological record of 5 major extinction events to work with, marine diversity begins to rebound within roughly 1 to 2 million years. New species evolve to fill vacant ecological niches. The survivors diversify. Complexity slowly rebuilds. The fossil record shows this pattern clearly after the end Ordovician extinction, after the late Devonian crisis, even after the end Cretaceous asteroid impact that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. After the Great Dying, this does not happen. The marine recovery is delayed by approximately 5 million years. 5 million years during which ocean ecosystems remain at a fraction of their former diversity, during which reef ecosystems do not exist anywhere on Earth, during which the fossil record of marine life is dominated by a small number of opportunistic generalist species that paleontologists describe with the technical term disaster fauna, the biological equivalent of weeds colonizing a burned building. The most characteristic disaster fauna of the early Triassic Ocean is a small bivalve called chlorea, a thin-shelled, rapidly reproducing clam that could tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions: low oxygen, high temperature, fluctuating chemistry. In early Triassic marine deposits around the world, chlorea is everywhere. Millions upon millions of shells, sometimes forming dense monocultures across the seafloor, their abundance a direct reflection of the absence of the competitors and predators that would normally keep any single species from dominating so completely. Chlorea is the Lystrosaurus of the ocean, unremarkable, tolerant, surviving precisely because it demands so little from the world around it. And the reason the recovery is delayed so severely is not mysterious. It is written in the same geochemical proxies that document the extinction itself. Ocean temperatures in the early Triassic did not cool rapidly after the extinction boundary. They remained elevated, in some tropical regions catastrophically so, for millions of years. Studies analyzing oxygen isotope ratios from conodont teeth, small tooth-like structures produced by an extinct group of early vertebrates that are exquisitely sensitive recorders of ocean temperature, have found evidence that equatorial sea surface temperatures during the early Triassic may have remained above 35 degrees Celsius for 2 to 3 million years after the extinction boundary. 2 to 3 million years of equatorial ocean temperatures hostile to most complex marine life. A research team led by Yadong Sun, publishing in the journal Science in 2012, analyzed conodont oxygen isotopes from multiple early Triassic sections and concluded that the tropics during this interval represented a thermal dead zone, a band around the equator where temperatures were simply too high for most marine animals to survive, reproduce, or maintain their body chemistry. Life was pushed toward higher latitudes, where conditions were somewhat cooler, but the total habitable area of the ocean was dramatically reduced. And the Siberian Traps, though declining from their maximum intensity, continued to erupt through much of the early Triassic, continued to inject carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
continued to drive the elevated temperatures that prevented recovery. The killing mechanism did not stop at the extinction boundary. It kept running at reduced intensity for millions of years afterward, enough to prevent the surviving lineages from diversifying, enough to knock back any tentative ecological recovery before it could gain momentum. Researchers studying early Triassic rock sections have identified multiple carbon isotope excursions through the interval, repeated pulses of isotopically light carbon injected into the ocean atmosphere system, each one representing a renewed burst of volcanic activity or a destabilization of ocean chemistry that set back whatever fragile recovery was attempting to begin. Each time life began to tentatively rebuild, something knocked it back. The pattern of repeated setbacks has led some researchers to describe the early Triassic not as a recovery interval, but as an extended survival crisis, a prolonged period during which the survivors of the Great Dying were themselves subjected to conditions nearly as hostile as those that caused the extinction in the first place. Evidence for continued stress in the early Triassic survivors comes from a remarkable source: the bones of Lystrosaurus itself. Bone histology is the study of bone tissue structure at the microscopic level. In living vertebrates, bone tissue records growth in annual increments. Periods of rapid growth during favorable seasons alternate with periods of slowed or arrested growth during harsh seasons, creating growth rings analogous to tree rings. When paleontologists section fossil bones and examine them under a microscope, they can read those rings as a record of the animal's life history: how fast it grew, how old it was when it died, whether it experienced periods of physiological stress. Studies of Lystrosaurus bone histology from early Triassic Karoo specimens, particularly work published by Jennifer Botha and colleagues, reveal something striking. Early Triassic Lystrosaurus individuals show higher frequencies of growth ring interruptions and stress markers than their late Permian counterparts. The survivors were not thriving in their emptied world. They were struggling, growing erratically, experiencing repeated physiological stress events consistent with unpredictable food availability, temperature extremes, and general ecological instability. Winning the survival lottery of the Great Dying did not mean inheriting a comfortable world. It meant inheriting a broken one. And the brokenness extended to the very chemistry of the soil and the atmosphere in ways that compounded the difficulties for land ecosystems. The collapse of the late Permian plant communities had removed the biological mechanisms that normally regulate soil chemistry and stability. Plant roots weathering rock release organic acids that drive chemical processes important for nutrient cycling. Leaf litter accumulating on forest floors creates the organic layer that supports decomposer communities and retains moisture. Tree canopies moderate temperature extremes at ground level. Mycorrhizal fungal networks, the underground connections between plant roots that facilitate nutrient transfer across entire forest communities, tie ecosystems together in ways invisible above ground, but fundamental to their function. All of this was gone. The early Triassic land was not simply a landscape without forests. It was a landscape without soil in any meaningful ecological sense, a surface of exposed mineral substrate subject to extreme temperature swings without vegetative buffering, prone to flash flooding when rain fell because there were no root systems to absorb or slow the water, desiccating rapidly during dry periods because there was no organic layer to retain moisture. Rebuilding functional soil chemistry from bare mineral substrate takes thousands to tens of thousands of years, even under favorable conditions. In the early Triassic, conditions were not favorable. The process was constantly interrupted by continued temperature extremes, by the erratic precipitation patterns of a destabilized climate system, by the ongoing low-level volcanic forcing from the declining but still active Siberian Traps. The coal gap is one of the most striking manifestations of this terrestrial devastation in the geological record. Coal forms from the compressed, transformed remains of plant material, forests that grew, died, accumulated as peat, and were buried and preserved over millions of years. In the geological record, coal seams are therefore a proxy for the existence of productive, long-lived plant communities. And in the rock record of the Permian-Triassic transition, there is an extraordinary gap in coal formation that spans approximately 10 million years, from the end Permian boundary through most of the early and middle Triassic. 10 million years with almost no coal formation anywhere on Earth. 10 million years during which the land surface did not support the dense, productive plant communities needed to generate peat. 10 million years that record, in the absence of a specific rock type, the extraordinary and prolonged devastation of the terrestrial biosphere. The coal gap was first identified and named by researchers in the 1980s, and its global extent, confirmed in formation after formation across every former Gondwana continent, is one of the most compelling lines of evidence for the depth and duration of ecological collapse on land after the Great Dying. In the oceans, an analogous signal appears in the reef gap, the 10 million year interval during which reef ecosystems essentially do not exist anywhere in the world. No rugose corals, because they are extinct. The scleractinian corals that will eventually replace them and build every reef on modern Earth have not yet evolved in sufficient diversity or abundance to construct reef frameworks. The 10 million year reef gap in the Triassic rock record is the oceanic equivalent of the coal gap on land, an absence that speaks more loudly than any presence. And yet, in those same early Triassic rocks, in the disaster fauna sediments and the barren terrestrial mudstones, hiding in the margins of the record, easily overlooked among the monotony of Claria shells and Lystrosaurus bones, there are survivors doing something quietly extraordinary. Not rebuilding, not yet, not in any way visible at the ecosystem level, but at the lineage level, at the level of individual evolutionary lines persisting through the dead zone, something important is happening in the background of the catastrophe. The cynodonts, those small, insectivorous, increasingly mammal-like therapsids that squeezed through the extinction boundary in severely reduced numbers, are still there in the early Triassic, still evolving. Their jaw structure, their teeth, their likely metabolic capabilities are all trending in a direction that will eventually produce something genuinely new, something the world has never seen before. The archosaurs, a group of reptiles that will split tens of millions of years in the future into the lineages leading to crocodilians on one side and pterosaurs and dinosaurs on the other, are present in the early Triassic in small, unprepossessing forms, struggling, surviving, persisting. The ray-finned fish, actinopterygians, that made it through the marine extinction in small numbers are already beginning to diversify in early Triassic deposits, occupying the empty ecological space left by the extinction of so many other marine groups. The story of the Great Dying's aftermath is not a story of rapid, dramatic recovery. It is a story of patient, grinding persistence through conditions that the biosphere had no right to survive. It is a story of lineages maintained at minimum viable population sizes through millions of years of ecological hell, carrying within their biology the evolutionary potential for an entirely different world. That world was coming. But before it arrived, before the dinosaurs rose, before the mammals diversified, before the modern ocean built its first Triassic reefs, there was one more chapter to endure in the dead zone. One more pulse of heat, one more chemical disruption,
One more setback in the long, painful stop-and-start process of planetary recovery. The Smithian-Spathian extinction, a smaller, less well-known crisis within the early Triassic, occurring roughly 1 million years after the main Permian-Triassic boundary, hit the recovering marine fauna with another round of elevated temperatures and ocean chemistry disruption, knocking back ammonite diversity and fish diversity just as both groups were beginning tentative recoveries. It is, in context, almost cruelly arbitrary. The world nearly destroyed, beginning painfully to rebuild, and then struck again. Not as severely as the Great Dying itself, but enough to delay recovery further, enough to extend the dead zone, enough to push the beginning of genuine ecological renewal even further into the Triassic future. The Earth does not recover from catastrophe on a schedule convenient for the life living through it. It recovers on its own terms, in its own time. And the creatures that eventually emerged from the dead zone, changed, diversified, filling the empty world with entirely new ecological strategies, were not the same creatures that entered it. They could not be. The world they inherited was not the same world. And the story of who those survivors became, what they did with the empty planet they found themselves holding, is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the catastrophe that cleared the way for them. Empty worlds do not stay empty. This is one of the most fundamental principles in all of evolutionary biology. Remove the occupants of an ecological space, through extinction, through catastrophe, through the kind of planetary-scale devastation we have been tracing through these chapters, and the survivors, however reduced, however diminished, will eventually move to fill it. Evolution does not tolerate a vacuum. Given time and a surviving lineage with sufficient genetic variability, natural selection will find a way. After the Great Dying, the world was as empty as it had been since before the Cambrian explosion. The ecological architecture of hundreds of millions of years, predator and prey hierarchies, specialized feeding guilds, complex symbiotic relationships, intricate food webs built layer upon layer, had been swept away almost entirely. What remained was a nearly blank canvas, and on that canvas, the survivors, battered, reduced, persisting in a broken world, began slowly and then faster to paint something entirely new. To understand what the world became after the Great Dying, we need to follow three lineages in particular. Three groups of survivors whose stories after the extinction are among the most consequential in the entire history of life on Earth. The first is one you know already: Lystrosaurus, the dicynodont that dominated the early Triassic land in such overwhelming numbers. It is tempting to focus on Lystrosaurus as a symbol of survival, which it is, but the dicynodonts as a broader group have a more complex story after the extinction than their early Triassic dominance might suggest. Through the Triassic, the dicynodonts diversify. From the Lystrosaurus monoculture of the earliest Triassic, the group expands into multiple species occupying different body sizes and feeding strategies. Some become large, very large. Lysowisia, a dicynodont discovered in Poland and described in a landmark paper published in Science in 2018, lived in the late Triassic and reached an estimated mass of approximately 9 tons, comparable in size to a modern elephant, making it one of the largest land animals of its time and the largest non-dinosaurian land animal known from the Triassic. 9 tons. In a group descended from an animal that survived the apocalypse as a generalist scavenger the size of a large dog. But the dicynodonts' long-term story ends in another extinction. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, approximately 201 million years ago, which eliminates the last dicynodont lineages and allows the dinosaurs to achieve their full ecological dominance. The Permian survivors become ultimately Triassic dead ends. Large, successful, ecologically important, but not the lineage that carries the future. The lineage that carries the future is the second group we need to follow, the cynodonts. Cynodonts are therapsids, members of the same broader evolutionary group as the gorgonopsids and the dicynodonts, but they are differentiated from those groups by a suite of anatomical features that trend consistently in one direction, toward the condition we recognize as mammalian. Their teeth are differentiated into incisors, canines, and complex multi-cusped cheek teeth capable of precise controlled food processing. Their lower jaw is dominated by the dentary bone, the single bone that forms the entire lower jaw in mammals, with the other ancestral jaw bones reduced and beginning their long evolutionary journey toward the mammalian middle ear. Their secondary palate, the bony shelf separating the nasal passage from the mouth, allowing them to breathe and chew simultaneously, is well developed. Their posture is increasingly erect, and critically, their metabolism is almost certainly running warm. Evidence for elevated metabolic rates in cynodonts comes from multiple sources. Bone histology shows rapid, sustained growth patterns inconsistent with the slow, seasonally interrupted growth typical of ectothermic reptiles. Some cynodont species show evidence of respiratory turbinates, delicate bony structures in the nasal passage that in modern mammals help retain moisture and heat in exhaled air, a feature associated with the high ventilation rates of warm-blooded metabolism. The general trend of cynodont evolution toward more precise food processing, more efficient locomotion, more complex sensory systems is consistent with the energetic demands of an increasingly elevated metabolic rate. Cynodonts enter the Permian-Triassic boundary as small, relatively minor players in the therapsid ecosystem. They exit the extinction as survivors, diminished, reduced in diversity, but alive. And in the empty world of the early and middle Triassic, they diversify. Not explosively. The dead zone conditions of the early Triassic constrain everyone equally, but persistently, steadily. The cynodont family tree branches and rebranches through the Triassic, producing an expanding variety of forms occupying an expanding range of ecological niches. Some remain small and insectivorous, the ecological role that may have been most survivable during the extinction itself, since insects and invertebrates, though devastated, were never completely eliminated. Others expand into herbivory, developing ever more complex tooth morphology for processing plant material. Some show evidence of increasingly mammalian reproductive strategies, possibly including early forms of lactation, that extraordinary mammalian innovation of producing specialized nutritional secretions to feed offspring. And then, deep in the Triassic, in fossil beds from South America and Africa and China, something crosses a threshold. The first true mammals appear. Exactly when the first true mammal evolved is a question that depends entirely on how you define mammal, a definitional problem that has generated considerable scientific argument, since the transition from advanced cynodont to mammal is precisely the kind of gradual, step-by-step evolutionary sequence that makes drawing a hard boundary difficult. But by approximately 225 million years ago, the middle to late Triassic, forms that most researchers would agree to call mammals are present in the fossil record. They are small, extraordinarily small. Most early Triassic and Jurassic mammals are estimated at between 2 and 10 grams, mouse-sized or smaller. They leave behind tiny teeth, delicate jaw fragments, occasionally partial skulls, but rarely complete skeletons. They lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs for over 150 million years. Nocturnal, perhaps, or crepuscular, their activity patterns determined by the need to avoid the large archosaurs that dominated every daylight ecological niche. But they were there. The lineage that began with Permian therapsids that squeezed through the Great Dying in the form of small, tough, generalist cynodonts that slowly and incrementally accumulated mammalian features over tens of millions of years of Triassic evolution, that lineage was alive, persisting, carrying forward the genetic and developmental toolkit that would, after another extinction event removed the dinosaurs, explode into the extraordinary diversity of modern mammals. Every mammal alive today, every whale and bat and elephant and mouse and human being, carries in its biology the legacy of that survival. The middle ear bones that allow mammals to hear frequencies no reptile can detect, the malleus and incus, derived from jawbones of cynodont ancestors repurposed by evolution for hearing, were freed from the jaw precisely because cynodonts survived the Great Dying with enough evolutionary momentum to complete that transition. Your ability to hear, your warm blood, your capacity to nurse offspring, your differentiated teeth, all of it traces back through an unbroken chain of ancestry to creatures that were alive on the Pangaean floodplain as the world ended around them. Creatures that survived when everything else died. Creatures that found, in the ruins of the Permian world, just enough to keep going. That is the second lineage. The third is the one that will define the next 150 million years of life on Earth in ways that the cynodonts and dicynodonts never quite managed. The archosaurs. Archosauria, the group whose name means ruling lizards, first appear in the early to middle Triassic as relatively modest, crocodile-like reptiles. They are not the dominant animals of the early Triassic. That role, as we have seen, belongs to Lystrosaurus and the remaining therapsids. The earliest archosaurs are medium-sized, largely terrestrial or semi-aquatic predators and herbivores, not immediately distinguishable from the general recovery fauna of the period as anything particularly special. But they have certain anatomical features that will prove, in the ecological context of the recovering Triassic world, to be enormously advantageous. Their ankle structure, the crurotarsal ankle of the crocodilian line, versus the more advanced mesotarsal ankle of the dinosaurian line, allows different locomotory strategies. Their tendency toward an increasingly erect posture, particularly in the dinosaurian lineage, reduces the energetic cost of locomotion compared to the more sprawling posture of most reptiles. And they show, at least in some lineages, evidence of elevated growth rates and possibly elevated metabolism. Not to the full mammalian level, but above the baseline reptilian condition. The Triassic world, recovering from the Great Dying, is in many respects ideal for the archosaurian body plan. The warm, equable climate of the Triassic, still significantly warmer than modern Earth, favors active, fast-growing animals. The ecological vacancies left by the Great Dying are vast. The competition from the therapsid survivors, though initially intense in the earliest Triassic, diminishes as the Triassic proceeds and various therapsid lineages decline. The archosaurs diverge into their two main evolutionary branches sometime in the early to middle Triassic. One branch leads to the crurotarsal archosaurs, the crocodilian line, which diversifies explosively through the Triassic into a remarkable variety of forms, including fully terrestrial bipedal predators, armored herbivores, and fast, slender pursuit hunters that look nothing like any modern crocodilian. In the Triassic, the crocodilian lineage is at least as diverse and ecologically dominant as the dinosaurian one. The other branch leads to the ornithodyrran archosaurs,
the line that includes the pterosaurs, the earliest flying vertebrates beyond insects, and the dinosaurs. The first dinosaurs appear in the fossil record in the late Triassic, around 230 to 240 million years ago, in formations including the Ischigualasto Formation of Argentina and the Santa Maria Formation of Brazil. They are not yet the giants that imagination conjures. Eoraptor, one of the earliest known dinosaurs, is estimated to have weighed approximately 10 kilograms, lighter than most modern dogs. Herrerasaurus, a contemporary early predatory dinosaur from the same Argentine formation, is larger but still modest, perhaps 3 to 4 meters long, 300 to 400 kilograms. These early dinosaurs are not dominant. They are not the obvious heirs of the Triassic world. For much of the Triassic, the crurotarsal archosaurs, the crocodilian relatives, are at least as diverse and at least as ecologically important. The dinosaurs are one group among several, competing for ecological space in a world that is still, tens of millions of years after the Great Dying, rebuilt. The same dynamic as after the Great Dying. The same principle. Empty worlds do not stay empty. And the surviving dinosaurs, radiating into the vacated ecological space of the early Jurassic, diversified with extraordinary speed into the full range of forms that will define the next 150 million years. Sauropods stretching their necks toward the canopies of Jurassic forests. Theropods diversifying from small, feathered insectivores through medium-sized pursuit hunters to the enormous apex predators of the late Jurassic and Cretaceous. Ornithischians, the bird-hip dinosaurs, evolving into armored ankylosaurs, plated stegosaurs, horned ceratopsians, duck-billed hadrosaurs. The age of dinosaurs that we think of when we think of the Mesozoic, that world of giants and apex predators and extraordinary biological diversity, is built on the foundation of two successive catastrophes: the Great Dying that ended the Permian, the Triassic-Jurassic event that cleared the competitors of the earliest dinosaurs. Catastrophe as opportunity. Destruction as the precondition for creation. It is not a comfortable narrative. It offers no guarantee that what comes after devastation will be better than what came before. Only that it will be different. The Permian world, with its gorgonopsids and its diverse therapsid communities and its extraordinary marine reefs, was not inferior to the Mesozoic world that replaced it. It was simply the world that came before. The world that, through a combination of geological accident and planetary bad luck, happened to be in the path of the Siberian Traps. And in the debris of its destruction, in the bones of the survivors and the empty ecologies they inherited, something new was given room to grow. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the modern ocean, everything that followed. All of it possible because the world ended and kept going anyway. Science is not a collection of answers. It is a collection of arguments. And nowhere in all of paleontology is the argument louder, more technically complex, more philosophically charged, or more consequential than in the ongoing debate over exactly what killed the Permian world. We have told this story so far with a certain narrative confidence. The Siberian Traps, the carbon dioxide, the warming oceans, the hydrogen sulfide, the ozone destruction, the cascading collapse. And that framework is real. It is supported by substantial evidence accumulated over decades of geological and geochemical research. Most paleontologists working on the end Permian extinction today would broadly accept that outline. But beneath that broad consensus lies a landscape of fierce, unresolved, technically demanding disagreement about timing, about mechanisms, about which killing agent was primary and which were secondary,
about whether the Siberian traps alone are sufficient to explain what the fossil record shows, or whether something else, something we have not yet identified or have not yet fully measured, must also have been at work. The Great Dying is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing investigation, and the arguments at its center tell us as much about the limits of geological knowledge as they do about the extinction itself. Start with the most fundamental question, the one that sounds simple but turns out to be extraordinarily difficult to answer with precision. How fast did it happen? We touched on this in an earlier chapter, the 2011 study by Shuzhong Shen and colleagues that used high-precision uranium-lead dating to compress the main extinction pulse to approximately 60,000 years. That study was landmark. It changed the field, but it did not end the debate. Subsequent high-precision dating studies have produced a range of estimates for the duration of the main extinction pulse, from as little as 30,000 years to as much as several 100,000 years, depending on which boundary section is being dated, which isotopic system is being used, and how the data are interpreted. The discrepancies are not errors. They reflect genuine uncertainties in the geochronological methods and genuine variability between different boundary sections around the world. Some researchers, studying boundary sections in the Karoo Basin of South Africa, have argued that the terrestrial extinction played out over a longer interval than the marine extinction recorded at Meishan, suggesting that the killing was not globally simultaneous, but geographically variable, with some regions experiencing more rapid or more severe environmental deterioration than others. This geographic variability hypothesis has significant implications. If the extinction was not a single global pulse, but a spatially variable cascade, hitting some regions first and hardest, reaching others later or less severely, then the identification of refugia becomes critically important. Were there places on Earth where the environmental deterioration was mild enough or delayed enough that ecosystems partially survived? Where diversity was maintained at levels sufficient to seed the eventual recovery? Some researchers have proposed that high-latitude regions, particularly parts of the southern hemisphere Gondwana, may have served as partial refugia during the worst of the end Permian crisis, with the Tethyan tropics bearing the brunt of the thermal and chemical extremes, while cooler southern regions retained somewhat higher diversity. Evidence for this comes from comparative studies of boundary sections in different latitudes, though the picture is complicated by the incompleteness of the fossil record in many high-latitude regions. But the geographic variability debate is relatively contained compared to the deeper argument about killing mechanisms. The Siberian Traps hypothesis, which is to say, the idea that volcanic outgassing from the Siberian Large Igneous Province drove the environmental changes that caused the extinction, is the current consensus view. But consensus is not unanimity, and the Siberian Traps hypothesis carries within it several significant unresolved tensions. The first tension is quantitative. Can the Siberian Traps, even at maximum estimated eruption rates, actually account for the speed and severity of the environmental changes recorded at the boundary? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a serious numerical problem that researchers have been working on for decades. The carbon isotope excursion at the boundary is extremely large, one of the largest in the geological record. Reproducing that excursion through volcanic outgassing alone requires either very large volumes of carbon released very quickly or additional carbon sources beyond direct volcanic degassing. The leading candidate for that additional source is the thermogenic release of carbon from the organic-rich sediments through which the Siberian magma intruded, the cooking of coal beds and evaporites that we discussed earlier. Studies estimating the total carbon available in those sediments, including a major analysis published in Nature Geoscience by Seth Burgess and colleagues, have attempted to calculate whether sufficient organic carbon was available to account for the isotope excursion. The calculations suggest it is plausible, but not definitively proven. The actual volume and carbon content of the contact metamorphic zones around Siberian sill intrusions is difficult to measure precisely, and estimates carry substantial uncertainty.
Some researchers have proposed that methane hydrates, deposits of methane frozen in deep ocean sediments, which can destabilize and release their carbon rapidly when ocean temperatures rise sufficiently, provided an additional carbon pulse on top of the volcanic forcing. A methane hydrate destabilization event would inject enormous quantities of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere very quickly, potentially explaining the rapidity of the isotope excursion better than volcanic outgassing alone. The methane hydrate hypothesis is supported by some geochemical evidence, but has not achieved consensus. The problem is distinguishing the isotopic signature of thermogenic methane. Platinum group elements are enriched in extraterrestrial material relative to Earth's crust, making them useful tracers for bolide impacts. Some studies have also reported the presence of shocked quartz grains showing microscopic deformation features that form only under the extreme pressures of a hypervelocity impact in boundary sediments. Geologist Luann Becker and colleagues published a series of papers in the late 1990s and early 2000s reporting fullerenes, carbon molecules in a distinctive cage structure in Permian Triassic boundary rocks, with trapped noble gases showing isotopic ratios suggesting extraterrestrial origin. This work generated enormous excitement and considerable controversy. The controversy proved well-founded. Subsequent attempts to replicate those fullerene findings in other boundary sections and using different analytical methods largely failed to confirm them. The platinum group element anomalies reported in some boundary sections have been interpreted by most researchers as consistent with volcanic sources rather than requiring extraterrestrial input. No unambiguous end Permian impact crater of appropriate size has been identified. The current scientific consensus is that there is no convincing evidence for a major bolide impact at the Permian Triassic boundary, and that the Siberian Traps provide a sufficient, if not yet perfectly quantified, explanation for the extinction. But the hypothesis has not been entirely abandoned. Periodically, new studies re-examine the geochemistry of boundary sections and report anomalies that are difficult to explain through purely volcanic mechanisms. The debate remains technically open, even if its scientific weight tilts heavily against impact involvement. There is a deeper philosophical reason why this debate persists. The end Cretaceous impact is sometimes used, consciously or unconsciously, as a template for what a mass extinction should look like. Sudden, externally caused, driven by a single identifiable catastrophic event. The Great Dying resists that template. It is slower, more complex, driven by internal planetary processes rather than external cosmic accident, and some researchers find that resistance frustrating, as if the Great Dying is being perversely uncooperative in refusing to yield to a clean, simple explanation. But perhaps the most important unresolved question, the one with the most direct scientific relevance beyond the Permian itself, is about thresholds. Environmental systems do not respond linearly to forcing. As temperature rises, as ocean pH falls, as atmospheric composition changes, the response of ecosystems is not a smooth, proportional decline. Instead, systems often remain relatively stable through moderate perturbations, then cross thresholds, tipping points, beyond which rapid, sometimes irreversible change occurs. The system flips from one stable state to another. The question at the heart of current end Permian research is,
Which thresholds were crossed, in which order, and how did crossing one threshold lower the threshold for the next? This is the cascade problem, and it is the most technically demanding and most consequential unsolved issue in great dying research. We know the broad sequence: volcanic forcing, warming, acidification, anoxia, ozone depletion, ecosystem collapse. But the detailed causal chain, the specific sequence of threshold crossings, the feedback loops between them, the precise timing of each mechanism's contribution to mortality, remains incompletely understood. A research group led by Jonathan Payne at Stanford University has spent years attempting to model the end Permian Ocean using coupled climate and biogeochemical models, computer simulations that attempt to capture the interactions between temperature, ocean circulation, chemistry, and biology.
Their work, published across multiple papers in journals including Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has been important in demonstrating that warming-driven oxygen loss, what they term the hypercapnia and hypoxia double stress, can by itself account for a large fraction of the marine extinction without requiring any additional. It matters enormously, because the rate of carbon dioxide increase in Earth's atmosphere since the beginning of industrial activity is, when plotted on the same geological timescale as the Permian-Triassic carbon cycle perturbation, faster. Not as large in total magnitude, not yet, but faster in rate. This is not a political statement. It is a geological one. The geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary provides empirical data about how Earth's biological systems respond to rapid carbon cycle perturbation. That data is what it is regardless of its implications. And what it shows, in the fossil record, in the geochemistry, in the sedimentology, is that rates of change that look gradual on a human timescale can be catastrophically fast on a biological and ecological one. The Great Dying is the most extreme example in the geological record of what happens when the carbon cycle moves faster than life can follow. And that is where the scientific debate ends, and the most uncomfortable part of this story begins. 252 million years ago, no one was watching. There was no species on Earth capable of measuring the carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere. No civilization to record the rising temperatures. No scientist extracting sediment cores from the ocean floor to read the chemical signature of catastrophe in real time. The Permian world had no warning system, no capacity to see what was coming, to understand the mechanisms driving it, to calculate the trajectory of the disaster before it became irreversible. The killing happened to a world that could not know it was being killed. We do not have that excuse. This is not the part of the story where a narrator pivots to politics or assigns blame or tells you what to think about the world you inhabit. The geological record does not do politics. It does not care about ideology or economics or the particular concerns of any species that happen to evolve late enough to read. The rocks simply record what happened, what the chemistry did, how the biology responded, what survived and what did not. But the rocks are specific, and their specificity is, if you are willing to sit with it honestly, deeply clarifying. Here is what the geological record of the Great Dying actually shows. It shows that Earth's climate system has tipping points, thresholds beyond which change becomes self-amplifying, where warming drives further warming, where ice loss exposes darker ocean that absorbs more heat, where permafrost thaw releases carbon that drives more warming, where ocean circulation slows in ways that reduce the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. The Permian-Triassic transition documents a cascade of exactly these feedback mechanisms operating at planetary scale. The Siberian Traps did not need to do all the work themselves.
They needed only to push the system far enough that the system's own internal feedbacks took over. It shows that the rate of change matters as much as the magnitude. The organisms that went extinct at the Permian-Triassic boundary did not die because the world was warm. The Permian world was already warm by modern standards. They died because the world changed faster than evolutionary adaptation, ecological adjustment, and physiological tolerance could accommodate. Speed was the weapon. The velocity of environmental shift outran the velocity of biological response. It shows that ocean acidification is a primary killing mechanism, not a secondary consequence. The dissolution of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons, the direct chemical attack on the organisms that form the base of marine food webs, does not require extreme temperatures or oxygen depletion to cause mass mortality. It requires only a sufficient drop in ocean pH, sustained for sufficient time. The Permian reefs did not need to be cooked. They needed only to be dissolved. And it shows that recovery from large-scale carbon cycle perturbation is measured not in years or decades or centuries, but in millions of years. The 10 million year coal gap, the 10 million year reef gap, the extended dead zone of the early Triassic. These are not the timescales of human planning horizons. They are not the timescales of any human institution. They are geological timescales, so vast that they are almost meaningless in practical human terms. Almost. Because here is the number that researchers keep returning to. The number that appears in papers published in Nature and Science and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and that has been independently calculated by multiple research groups using different methods and different datasets. The rate of carbon dioxide injection into the atmosphere during the most intense phase of the Siberian Traps eruption, the phase most directly associated with the main extinction pulse, has been estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 gigatons of carbon per year. Some estimates are higher, some are lower. The uncertainty is genuine and significant. The current rate of carbon dioxide emission from human industrial and agricultural activity is approximately 10 gigatons of carbon per year, 10 times faster than the Siberian Traps at their most lethal. This comparison requires careful handling. It is not a simple equivalence. The Siberian Traps sustained their output for hundreds of thousands of years. The total carbon released dwarfs anything in the human industrial record so far. The baseline climate state of the late Permian was different from today's. The geography of the continents, the configuration of ocean basins, the state of the biosphere, all different in ways that affect how climate systems respond to forcing. A geologist or climate scientist reading those caveats will nod. They are real and important. The comparison between the Siberian Traps and modern emissions is not a precise one.
But imprecision is not the same as irrelevance. What the Great Dying tells us, empirically in the language of rocks and chemistry and fossil records, is that the Earth's carbon cycle can be disrupted to catastrophic effect. That disruption does not require science fiction quantities of forcing. It requires sustained perturbation past critical thresholds. And it tells us that when those thresholds are crossed, the response of biological systems is not proportional and gradual. It is nonlinear, potentially catastrophic, potentially, as the Permian record shows, nearly irreversible on any timescale that matters to living things. Researcher Peter Ward, a paleontologist at the University of Washington who has spent decades studying mass extinctions and their mechanisms, has written extensively about what he calls the Medea hypothesis, the idea that life on Earth is not simply a self-sustaining, self-correcting system trending toward greater complexity and stability,
but a system capable of generating the conditions for its own near destruction. The Great Dying, in Ward's framing, is the most extreme example of this, a case where geological processes generated by Earth's own internal dynamics came within a fraction of ending complex life entirely. Ward's hypothesis is controversial among biologists who favor a more Gaian view of life as fundamentally self-regulating. But the Great Dying sits uncomfortably in any framework that assumes automatic stabilization. The Earth did not correct toward habitability during the extinction. It overcorrected toward lethality. The feedbacks amplified the initial forcing rather than dampening it. The stabilizing mechanisms, the ocean's carbon buffering capacity, the biological pump that sequesters carbon in deep water sediments, the weathering of silicate rocks that slowly draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, were overwhelmed by the speed and scale of the perturbation. They did eventually reassert themselves over millions of years, slowly pulling the system back toward the conditions that support complex life. But on the time scale of the living things that existed when the cascade began, on the time scale of the gorgonopsids and the rugose corals and the trilobites, the stabilizing mechanisms arrived too late. This is the warning in the stone, not a prophecy, not a certainty about any particular future. The Great Dying is not a perfect template for what must happen under any specific set of modern conditions. The world today is different enough from the Permian that direct extrapolation is scientifically irresponsible. But it is an empirical demonstration, the most extreme and complete demonstration in the geological record of what Earth systems are capable of doing when pushed beyond their operating range, of what cascading feedbacks look like when they are not theoretical constructs in a computer model, but real events recorded in real rock across every continent and every ocean basin on Earth. The stones of the Permian-Triassic boundary are the most complete archive of planetary catastrophe that we have. Every layer of that boundary section at Meishan, every centimeter of carbon-rich clay, every shift in isotope ratio, every zone of absent fossils followed by sparse, stunted, stressed survivors is data. Hard, physical, irreplaceable data about how the Earth responds to rapid carbon cycle perturbation. And we are the first species in Earth's 4.5 billion year history that can read it. The trilobites could not read it. The gorgonopsids could not read it. The strange coiled ammonites navigating the darkening waters of the dying Tethys Ocean had no way to understand what was happening to their world or why. They simply experienced it. The warming water, the thinning shells, the failing chemistry. Without context, without comprehension, without the capacity to recognize the mechanism of their own extinction. We can read it. We have the geochronology. We have the isotope geochemistry. We have the paleontological record and the climate models and the biogeochemical simulations. We have the names of the killing mechanisms and a detailed, if imperfect, understanding of how they interacted. We have the timeline of the disaster and the chemical fingerprints of the agents that drove it and the biological record of what survived and what did not. We can read the warning that the Permian world wrote in its own destruction. Whether we choose to is a different question. And it is not a geological one. But let us end not with that weight, not with the pressure of the present moment and its implications, but with something that the fossil record also contains, something that the Great Dying's aftermath also demonstrates with equal empirical force. Life did not end. 96% of all marine species, 70% of all land vertebrates, The insects nearly gone, the reefs dissolved, the forests burned and stripped and poisoned, the ocean chemistry inverted, the atmosphere thick with volcanic poison, the land bare and eroding and lethally hot. And still, life. Lystrosaurus on its barren floodplain, a handful of ammonite lineages in the marginal refugia of the cooling high-latitude seas, cynodont survivors in whatever burrows and crevices offered shelter from the killing heat, microbial mats spreading across the empty ocean floor, doing what microbial life has always done, metabolizing, reproducing, chemically reworking the environment in the direction of conditions that more complex life can eventually re-inhabit. The tenacity of life, demonstrated at the extremity of the great dying, is not a comforting platitude. It is an empirical observation. Life at its most reduced, life stripped to the most basic, most tolerant, most generalist remnants of a formerly complex biosphere, still found a way, still held the thread, still carried forward, in the genes of a few surviving lineages, the potential for everything that came after. The gorgonopsids are gone. They left no descendants. Their particular version of the predatory body plan, those extraordinary saber-teeth, that transitional posture between reptile and mammal, that evolutionary experiment running for tens of millions of years, ended at the Permian-Triassic boundary and was never resumed. But the lineage that produced them, the synapsids, the group to which they and we both belong, did not end. The cynodonts carried it forward, through the dead zone, through the early Triassic's prolonged ecological nightmare, through 150 million years of living in the shadow of the dinosaurs, through the Triassic-Jurassic extinction and the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, and finally, through the end Cretaceous impact that cleared the dinosaurs and opened the ecological space for the mammalian explosion that eventually produced, among millions of other things, a primate curious enough to dig up the bones of the past and ask what they mean. The synapsid lineage, your lineage, began its relationship with mass extinction in the Permian, and it survived, every time. Not without cost, not without loss, not without millions of years of diminishment and hardship and narrow escapes, but it survived. You are the result of that survival. Your existence, your ability to read these words, to think about deep time, to hold in your imagination the vision of a Permian reef or a gorgonopsid on a Pangaean floodplain or the dark sulfurous waters of the dying Tethys, is the direct biological consequence of the fact that your ancestors made it through the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. The Great Dying killed 96% of everything. It did not kill the thread that leads to you. That thread, fragile, improbable, contingent on 10,000 lucky accidents of survival across 252 million years, is the most extraordinary thing the fossil record contains. More extraordinary than the largest sauropod, more extraordinary than the sharpest gorgonopsid tooth or the most intricate ammonite shell. The fact that life, reduced to almost nothing, living in a broken world, stripped of complexity and diversity and ecological richness, kept going until the world healed, kept going until the empty spaces filled again, kept going until the long, slow grinding process of evolutionary recovery produced from the wreckage of the Permian a Mesozoic world of extraordinary life and color and complexity. And then kept going further still, through the dinosaur age and beyond it, through the mammalian explosion of the Paleogene, through the cooling of the Miocene and the ice ages of the Pleistocene, through every extinction and recovery and restructuring that the Earth's long history contains. Until here. Until now. Until you. The rocks of the Permian-Triassic boundary are still there, in the limestone quarry at Meishan, in the red mudstones of the Karoo, in the Arctic sediments of Svalbard, in 100 other places around the world where the line between the old world and the new is written in stone. That golden spike at Meishan, the marker that defines the base of the Triassic, the official boundary between before and after, is still in the rock, sitting in the wall of the quarry, marking the most catastrophic single moment in the history of complex life. Go stand in front of it if you ever have the chance. Run your hand across the boundary clay. Feel the transition from the fossil-rich Permian limestone below to the empty Triassic rock above. From a world full of life to a world almost emptied of it, in the thickness of your fingernail. And think about what survived. Think about what persisted in conditions that should have ended everything long enough for the world to recover. Long enough for the empty oceans to fill again, and the barren lands to grow forests again, and the evolutionary experiments of the Triassic to eventually produce the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and the Paleogene and the world we inhabit now. The Great Dying is the most complete proof we have that life on Earth is both far more fragile and far more resilient than we tend to imagine, that the same forces which come within a hair of ending everything can be survived, at terrible cost over unimaginable time, by the thread of life that holds on just long enough. It is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and it is written in the stones beneath your feet, patient, permanent, waiting for anyone willing to kneel down and read long enough. It is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and it is written in the stones beneath your feet, patient, permanent, waiting for anyone willing to kneel down and read